The instrument panel blurs. Not from tears, Lieutenant Junior Grade Eugene Valencia doesn't have time for tears, but from the G-forces pressing him into his seat as he pulls his F6F Hellcat into a climbing turn. Below him, somewhere in the churning grey of the Philippine Sea, a Japanese Zero is corkscrewing toward the water, trailing black smoke like a funeral shroud. 4 seconds ago, Zero's pilot was alive, thinking, making decisions. Now he's just mass and velocity, obeying physics on the way to impact. It's the 19th of June, 1944. The sky over the Philippine Sea is a geometry problem written in tracer fire and burning aviation fuel. Valencia's wingman, Lieutenant Harris Mitchell, calls out another bogey at 2 o'clock high. Valencia doesn't need to look. He already knows what he'll see. Another Mitsubishi, a 6M, another young Japanese pilot who has perhaps 20 seconds left to live, maybe less, now that Valencia's 6 Browning machine guns are tracking toward him. The mathematics of this moment are simple and absolute. The Japanese pilot is 400 yards out. Valencia's Hellcat is closing at roughly 300 miles per hour relative speed. That's 440 feet per second. 400 yards equals 1,200 feet. The Zero pilot has approximately 2.7 seconds before Valencia opens fire. Then another 17, maybe 18 seconds of violent maneuvering before the equations resolve into fire or water or both. 20 seconds. That's the window. That's all the time the Japanese Naval Air Arm has left, not just in this engagement, but as a fighting force. They just don't know it yet. But let's step back. Back before mathematics became this brutal. Back to when both sides believed different things about what would win this war. The Mitsubishi A6M0 entered service in the summer of 1940, and for 2 years it was the most feared fighter aircraft in the Pacific Theater. Maximum speed, 331 miles per hour. Service ceiling, 33,000 feet. Range with drop tanks, 1,600 miles. But the number that mattered most to pilots was the turn radius. The Zero could complete a sustained turn in under 16 seconds at combat speeds. No Allied fighter could match it. In the early years 1941, 1942, American pilots flying Brewster Buffaloes and early model Grumman F6F Wildcats learned a brutal lesson. You did not dogfight a Zero. The kill ratios told the story. At the Battle of the Coral Sea in May of 1942, Japanese Zeros shot down 66 Allied aircraft while losing only 21 of their own. Over the Solomon Islands in the summer of 1942, the ratio sometimes ran 7-1 in favor of the Japanese. The Zero's designer, Jiro Horikoshi, had made a conscious decision: sacrifice everything for performance. No armor plating behind the pilot's seat. No self-sealing fuel tanks. No bulletproof windscreen. Every pound devoted to range, speed, and that legendary maneuverability. The result was an aircraft that weighed 5,300 pounds empty and could turn inside anything the Americans flew. American fighter pilots called them Zeeks or Zeros and learned to respect them. The official tactical guidance from 1942 was blunt. Do not attempt to dogfight the Zero. Use your aircraft's superior diving speed and armor to make slashing attacks and disengage before the Zero can bring its maneuverability advantage to bear. But respect and fear are different things, and by mid-1942, American pilots feared the Zero. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. In December of 1942, something changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but with the quiet certainty of an industrial power making a decision. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, based in Bethpage, New York, delivered the first production model F6F Hellcat to the Navy. The Hellcat looked nothing like the Zero. Where the Zero was graceful, almost delicate, the Hellcat was blunt and heavy. Empty weight, 9,200 pounds, nearly 2,000 pounds heavier than the Zero. It had a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine producing 2,000 horsepower, almost twice the power of the Zero's Nakajima Sake engine. Maximum speed, 380 miles per hour, nearly 50 miles per hour faster than the Zero. But speed wasn't the revolutionary part. Neither was the armament, though 650 caliber Browning M2 machine guns with 400 rounds per gun was formidable. The revolution was in philosophy. Leroy Grumman, the company's founder, had studied every combat report from the Pacific. He'd read the after-action summaries from Coral Sea, Midway, and Guadalcanal. He'd examined captured Zeros, measuring the thickness of the aluminum skin, noting the complete absence of armor. And he'd drawn a conclusion that seems obvious now but was revolutionary then. The goal wasn't to build a fighter that could outmaneuver the Zero. The goal was to build a fighter that could survive being shot while shooting back. The Hellcat had thick armor plating behind the pilot's seat, quarter-inch steel. The windscreen was bulletproof glass, thick enough to stop a 20mm cannon shell. The fuel tanks were self-sealing, hit them with a 50 caliber round, and the rubber lining would swell and close the hole within seconds. The control surfaces were fabric-covered metal, tough enough to take multiple hits and keep flying. A Zero hit by a single 50 caliber incendiary round in the fuel tank would bloom into fire within seconds. American pilots called them flying Zippos, after the cigarette lighter, flick and flame. A Hellcat could absorb dozens of hits and bring the pilot home. The mathematics had shifted, but it would take actual combat to prove it. The Hellcat entered combat in August of 1943 during operations over Marcus Island. The early results were promising but not spectacular. The aircraft was fast, tough, and well armed, but American pilots were still learning how to use it. The old instincts dive away from the Zero, never turn with it, were hard to unlearn. Lieutenant Commander John Thack, who'd invented the defensive weaving tactic that bore his name, was one of the first to understand what the Hellcat represented. In a briefing to VF-9 Squadron in October of 1943, he said, "The Hellcat isn't trying to be a Zero, it's trying to be a Zero killer. There's a difference. The difference was tactical. American doctrine evolved throughout 1943 and early 1944. Never fight alone. Always maintain altitude advantage. Use speed and power to dictate the terms of engagement. Attack in pairs using the thatch weave, two fighters scissoring back and forth, so that when an enemy latched onto one fighter's tail, his wingman was already turning to shoot the attacker. Most importantly, use the guns. The Hellcat's 650 calibers, synchronized to converge at 400 yards, could put 75 rounds per second into a target. The rate of fire on the M2 Browning was 750 rounds per minute per gun. 4,500 rounds per minute total. Each 50 caliber bullet weighed 43 grams and left the barrel at 2,900 feet per second. A 2-second burst meant 150 rounds in the air. A Zero's fuel tank, unarmored and vulnerable, was roughly 6 feet long and 2 feet in diameter. At 400 yards, a competent Hellcat pilot could put 20 to 30 rounds into that tank. One incendiary round was enough. The Zero's offensive armament was formidable on paper. Two 20mm Type 99 and cannons with 60 rounds each, and two 7.7mm Type 97 machine guns with 500 rounds each. The 20mm shells hit harder than 50 caliber rounds, but the cannons had a slower rate of fire, 500 rounds per minute, and with only 60 rounds per gun, the Japanese pilot had roughly 7 seconds of total firing time before the cannons went dry. 7 seconds versus 19 seconds. Those numbers would matter. By early 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier air arm was in crisis, though few people outside the highest levels of command understood the full scope. The problem wasn't aircraft production. Japan could still build Zeros at a reasonable rate, though nothing close to American output. The problem was pilots. Training a carrier-qualified fighter pilot takes time. In 1941, Japanese naval aviators underwent rigorous training: basic flight training, advanced fighter tactics, carrier qualification, gunnery practice. The entire program took roughly 2 years and produced pilots with 300 to 400 hours of flight time before their first combat deployment. These men were superb. At Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, they demonstrated what elite training and superior equipment could accomplish. But by 1944, most of those elite pilots were dead. The mathematics of attrition are unforgiving. If you lose 5% of your pilots per month in combat operations, and you're engaged in continuous combat operations, within a year you've lost more than half your original force. The veterans of Pearl Harbor and the Darwin raids were either dead, captured, or rotated back to training commands where they tried desperately to pass on their knowledge to the next generation. Except there wasn't enough time for the next generation. By mid-1944, Japanese pilot training had been compressed. The program that once took 2 years now took 6 months. Flight time before carrier qualification, 100 hours, sometimes less. These weren't the veterans who'd bombed Pearl Harbor. These were teenagers, some as young as 17, with barely enough training to land on a carrier deck without supervision, let alone engage American fighters in combat. The Americans, meanwhile, were expanding their training pipeline. By 1944, the U.S. Navy's pilot training program required 600 hours before carrier qualification. 600 hours versus 100 hours. Mathematics was becoming impossible. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa knew the mathematics. In May of 1944, he commanded the first mobile fleet, the remnant of Japan's once dominant carrier force. On paper, his force looked formidable. 9 aircraft carriers, including the fleet carriers Taiho, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. 430 aircraft. Against him, Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 58, with 15 fleet carriers and over 900 aircraft. Ozawa had 2 advantages, or thought he did. First, the Zero's superior range meant Japanese carriers could launch strikes from 300 miles out, beyond the range of American counterstrikes. Second, Japanese aircraft could land at bases on Guam and Rota, refuel, rearm, and either return to the carriers or launch another strike from land bases. In theory, this gave Ozawa the ability to shuttle bomb the American fleet, hitting them from multiple directions while staying out of their strike range. On paper, it was a sound plan. But paper doesn't account for reality. Reality number 1. American submarines had been tracking Ozawa's fleet for days. The submarines Kavala and Albacore were already positioned along his route, reporting his every movement. The Americans knew he was coming, knew his course, knew his speed. Reality number 2. American cryptanalysts had broken Japanese naval codes. They couldn't read every message, but they could read enough to understand Japanese intentions and dispositions. There would be no surprise. Reality number 3. Overnight on the 18th of June, American carrier aircraft had bombed the airfields on Guam into smoking ruin. The shuttle bombing concept required functional runways. Those runways were now cratered and unusable. Reality number 4. American radar could detect incoming aircraft at 100 miles. The Japanese strike force wouldn't achieve surprise. The Hellcats would be airborne and positioned before the first Zero crossed the outer screen. Ozawa's plan was based on advantages that no longer existed, but he didn't know that yet. On the morning of the 19th of June, 1944, he launched his strike. Petty Officer First Class Kiyoshi Ogawa wasn't his real name. He's a composite, drawn from after-action reports and survivor accounts, representing dozens of young Japanese pilots who flew that day. But the details of his morning are real, drawn from documented accounts. He woke at 04:30 on the carrier Zuikaku. Breakfast was rice, pickled vegetables, and miso soup. The rice was short-grained and sticky, nothing like the abundant white rice of peacetime, but better than the compressed rations issued to army units fighting in New Guinea or Burma. The officers said nothing during the meal. Everyone knew what the day would bring. The briefing at 0600 was brief. The American carrier force was approximately 300 miles to the east. Weather: scattered clouds at 8,000 feet, visibility 10 miles, sea state, moderate, wind from the southeast at 15 knots. The first strike wave would consist of 69 aircraft, 43 Zeros, 16 Yokosuka D, 4 Y Judy dive bombers, and 10 Nakajima B-6N Jill torpedo bombers. The American fleet has radar, the squadron leader said. Young officer, academy graduate, perhaps 25 years old. They will detect us at long range. Expect heavy fighter. Opposition: maintain formation discipline. Execute your attacks and return to the rally point. Return to the rally point, as if that were a certainty rather than a fading possibility. Kiyoshi had 4 confirmed kills: 2 Wildcats over the Solomons in late 1942, 2 P-40 Warhawks over New Guinea in early 1943. He'd been flying combat operations for nearly 2 years, which made him a veteran by the standards of mid-1944. He'd trained pilots, passed on what he knew about deflection shooting and energy management, but he could see the fear in the younger pilots' faces. Kids, really. Some with fewer than 50 hours in the Zero. The launch began at 0830. The Zuikaku turned into the wind, deck crew guiding each aircraft into position. The flag went down, the Zero's engine roared, and Kiyoshi felt the familiar surge of acceleration as the deck dropped away, and he climbed into the grey morning. The formation assembly took 20 minutes. 69 aircraft circled, finding their positions, forming up by type and squadron. Then they turned east, toward the American fleet, toward mathematics they couldn't yet see but would soon understand completely. The radar operators on the destroyer USS Yarnell detected them at 0955. Range, 130 miles. Bearing, 270 degrees. Large formation, multiple contacts. The alert went out across Task Force 58, raid inbound, launch all fighters. On the carrier USS Lexington, the flight deck was already a controlled chaos of activity. Hellcats lined up wing to wing, engines turning, pilots strapped in. The flag dropped, and the first fighter roared down the deck, followed 5 seconds later by the next, and the next, until the sky was full of dark blue shapes climbing toward their combat air patrol stations. By 10:15, there were 75 Hellcats in the air at various altitudes between 15,000 and 25,000 feet. Fighter director officers aboard the carriers, watching the radar scopes, directed the fighters toward the incoming raid. The system was called Combat Information Center, and it represented a fundamental shift in how naval battles were fought. No longer did pilots search visually for the enemy. Instead, they were vectored by radio to intercept points calculated by radar operators and plotted on plotting boards. Vector 270, Angels 20, many bandits. The Hellcat pilots acknowledged and turned west, climbing. Many bandits. That meant more than 20 enemy aircraft. Possibly many more. Lieutenant Eugene Valencia, leading a 4-plane division from VF9, reached 20,000 feet and leveled off. The morning sun was behind him, which was good. Height and sun were the fighter pilot's advantage. His 3 wingmen were in loose formation, stepped down and back, each pilot scanning a sector of sky. At 10:28, Valencia spotted them. Tally-ho, 11 o'clock low, many bandits. Below him, perhaps 60 or 70 aircraft in loose formation. Zeros mixed with dive bombers and torpedo bombers. They looked small at this distance, like insects crawling across the grey ocean. Valencia pushed his stick forward and dove. The first pass happened fast. Valencia's division came in from high and behind, the sun at their backs. The Japanese formation didn't react until the Hellcats were within 600 yards. By then, it was too late. Valencia selected a target, a Judy dive bomber, the rear man in a three-plane section. He aligned his nose, watched the gunsight popper track onto Judy's fuselage, and pressed the trigger. The Hellcat shuddered as all 6 guns fired. 2 seconds, 30 rounds per gun, 180 rounds total. Judy's right wing separated. Not tore off, separated, as if detached by invisible hands. The bomber rolled inverted and fell. Valencia pulled up hard, bleeding off speed, scanning for threats. His wingman, Lieutenant Mitchell, was on his left, also climbing. Behind them, the remaining 2 Hellcats in the division were engaging targets, tracers stitched across the sky. A Zero turned toward Valencia, but slowly, tentatively, the Japanese pilot seemed uncertain. Valencia extended, used his superior speed to open distance, then came back around in a wide, flat turn. The Zero tried to follow but couldn't match the Hellcat's roll rate. Within seconds, Valencia was on his tail. 400 yards. The Zero pilot was banking hard left, pulling maximum G. A good evasive maneuver against another Zero. But the Hellcat wasn't following the turn. Valencia used his power and speed to climb, maintaining position above and behind. The Zero's pilot realized his mistake and reversed direction, but the move cost him energy. He was slower now, mushing through the turn. Valencia dropped his nose, lined up the shot, and fired. 3-second burst, 225 rounds. The Zero's engine cowling disintegrated. Pieces of metal spun away. Smoke poured from the cowling, then fire. The Zero rolled inverted and dove, trailing a streamer of orange flame. Valencia's radio was chaotic. Multiple voices calling out targets, warnings, kills. Splash 1, Judy. 0 at 4 o'clock, break right. I'm Winchester, returning to base. Winchester, out of ammunition. The entire engagement lasted perhaps 8 minutes. Valencia's division alone shot down 11 enemy aircraft, possibly more. Valencia landed back on Lexington at 11:05, with ammunition remaining in 5 of his 6 guns. The 6th gun had jammed after 200 rounds. The mission summary, filed later that day, was clinical. Intercepted enemy strike force at 10:28. Engaged multiple targets. Excellent coordination. No friendly losses. No friendly losses. That was the key phrase. That was the new mathematics. The Japanese strike force that launched at 0830 from the carriers of 1st Mobile Fleet numbered 69 aircraft. Of those 69, 42 were shot down before reaching the American fleet. Another 8 were shot down by anti-aircraft fire from the screening destroyers. 5 more crashed, attempting to land at Guam on fuel-starved engines. 14 aircraft returned to the carriers, 14 out of 69. Ozawa launched 3 more strike waves that day. The results were similar or worse. By nightfall on the 19th of June, 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy had lost 243 carrier aircraft in combat, with another 50 lost to operational causes, crashes, fuel exhaustion, landing accidents. Total, 293 aircraft gone in one day. American losses, 29 aircraft destroyed in combat, 6 damaged beyond repair. Total, 35. The kill ratio was approximately 8-1, though some historians calculate it as high as 12-1 depending on how operational losses are counted. But numbers don't convey the texture of it, the feel of it, what it meant to be in the cockpit when the mathematics became visible. The pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot almost immediately. The name appears in squadron after-action reports filed within 48 hours of the battle. It wasn't meant cruelly, though it sounds cruel now. It was descriptive. Turkey shoots were country fair events where live turkeys were released and shooters competed to hit them. The turkeys didn't have much of a chance. Neither did the Japanese pilots on the 19th of June, 1944. Commander David McCampbell, who would end the war as the Navy's leading ace with 34 confirmed kills, described it in his memoir with something approaching discomfort. It wasn't a fight. A fight implies both sides have a chance. This was more like execution. They kept coming, and we kept shooting them down. Some of them flew straight and level for 5-6 seconds. In fighter combat, if you fly straight and level for 5 seconds, you're already dead. You just haven't stopped moving yet. Lieutenant Alexander Vrasiu of VF-16, flying from USS Lexington, shot down 6 Japanese aircraft in 8 minutes. When he landed, the deck crew counted his remaining ammunition, 60 rounds total across all 6 guns. He'd fired 2,340 rounds. His gun barrels were so hot they'd discolored the paint on his wings. A newsreel cameraman asked him how it felt. Vrasiu thought for a moment, then said, "Like shooting ducks on a pond." Except the ducks were trying to shoot back. They just couldn't. The analogy was apt, but incomplete. The ducks were trying to shoot back. They simply didn't have the training, the tactics, or the time. Let's talk about the 20 seconds in detail. The specific material reality of what happened when a Hellcat locked onto a zero. 400 yards was the standard firing range for American pilots by mid-1944. The 650 caliber Brownings were harmonized, meaning the guns were angled so their fire converged at exactly 400 yards. At that distance, all 6 streams of bullets intersected in a cone, roughly 6 feet in diameter. A Zero's fuselage was approximately 4 feet wide at its widest point. The math was favorable. The closing speed in a typical engagement was 300 miles per hour combined. That's 440 feet per second. 400 yards equals 1,200 feet. So, from the moment a Hellcat pilot began his attack run to the moment he opened fire, approximately 2.7 seconds. But the Japanese pilot usually didn't know he was being attacked until the first tracers went past his canopy. American pilots learned to hold fire until they were sure of the shot. No wasted ammunition. No warning. 1 or 2 tracer rounds, mixed with every 5 regular rounds, meant that when you saw the tracers, there were already 4 bullets you didn't see in the space between. So the Japanese pilot's actual warning time was less than the 2.7 seconds. Call it 2 seconds, maybe less. His first instinct drilled into him during training was to turn. The Zero could outturn anything. Bank hard, pull maximum G-force, use the superior maneuverability to force the American into an overshoot. It had worked in 1942. It had worked in 43. The muscle memory was there. Except the Hellcat wasn't trying to follow the turn. The Hellcat pilot would fire a burst 2 seconds, 150 rounds, and then use his superior power-to-weight ratio to climb or extend, maintain energy, maintain position. The Zero pilot, committed to his turn, would bleed off airspeed, his turn would tighten but slow, and the Hellcat would already be repositioning for another pass. This was the critical moment. The Japanese pilot had perhaps 10 seconds to make a decision, continue the turn, and hope to come around on the Hellcat's tail, which wouldn't work because the Hellcat was already climbing away, or reverse his turn, try to regain energy, look for escape routes. But by the time the Japanese pilot recognized his first turn wasn't working, the Hellcat's wingman was already positioned, the thatch weave, always 2 fighters, always mutually supporting. While the Zero maneuvered against one Hellcat, the other was setting up the kill shot. 15 seconds gone, 5 seconds remaining. The second burst came from a different angle. The Japanese pilot, focused on the first Hellcat, often didn't see the second until the bullets hit. 50 caliber rounds traveling at 2,900 feet per second. Each round carried 1,900 foot-pounds of kinetic energy. One round could punch through the Zero's unarmored fuel tank, the cockpit, the engine block. A 2-second burst meant 30 rounds per gun, 180 rounds total. Statistical probability said 20 to 30 rounds would hit. The Zero's fuel tank held 160 gallons of aviation gasoline, high octane, volatile. 1 incendiary round, 18 seconds. Fire in an aircraft happens fast. The fuel ignites, the flames race along fuel lines, the cockpit fills with smoke. The pilot has maybe 3 seconds to decide. Try to fight the fire and save the aircraft, or bail out. But the Zero's canopy was difficult to open in flight. The mechanism required sliding it back against significant air pressure. Some pilots had filed down the rails to make it easier, but that was against regulations, and not all pilots did it. If the canopy was stuck, if the pilot was injured, if the smoke was too thick, 20 seconds, give or take, not enough time to think clearly. Not enough time to execute a well-planned escape. Just enough time to understand what was happening and why. The USS Kavala, a Gato-class submarine, was positioned roughly 30 miles northeast of Ozawa's carrier force on the afternoon of the 19th of June. Commander Herman Kostler, the sub's captain, had been tracking the Japanese fleet for 2 days, surfacing periodically to radio position reports back to Task Force 58. At 14:09, Kostler's periscope operator reported a target. A large carrier, identified as Shokaku class, screened by 3 destroyers. The carrier was recovering aircraft. The flight deck was active, Zeros landing one after another, some trailing smoke, some with visible damage. Kostler maneuvered Kavala into the attack position. At 14:20, he fired a spread of 6 torpedoes from a range of 1,200 yards. The torpedoes were Mark 14s, the same problematic design that had plagued American subs early in the war, but by mid-44, most of the bugs were worked out. 4 torpedoes missed, 2 hits. The carrier was Shokaku, a veteran of Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, Santa Cruz. She'd survived multiple battles, multiple bomb hits, but 2 Mark 14 torpedoes, each carrying 660 pounds of Torpex explosive, hitting below the waterline. The physics were unforgiving. The first torpedo hit amidships, rupturing fuel bunkers. Aviation gasoline flooded the lower decks. The second hit aft, near the engine rooms. Shokaku lost power almost immediately. The damage control teams fought the flooding, fought the fires, but aviation gasoline on water is nearly impossible to extinguish. It floats. It spreads. It burns. At 15:01, a massive explosion tore through Shokaku's hull. The carrier had been refueling and rearming aircraft. The hangar deck was full of bombs, torpedoes, and aviation fuel. When the fires reached the ordnance, 1,200 men were aboard Shokaku when Kavala's torpedoes hit. 887 survived. The carrier sank at 15:10, 3 hours after the air battle ended, taking with her the last surviving carrier from the Pearl Harbor attack force. An hour later, USS Albacore put 3 torpedoes into the fleet carrier Taiho, Japan's newest, most modern carrier, commissioned just 3 months earlier. She sank at 15:32 with over 1,600 men aboard. 2 fleet carriers are gone, not to air attack. To submarines that the Japanese screening forces never detected until the torpedoes were already in the water. The mathematics were compounding. Air losses plus carrier losses plus pilot losses equaled a tactical catastrophe, but it was worse than that, because the pilots who did survive, who did make it back to their carriers, brought with them something more damaging than their casualty reports. They brought the truth. Warrant Officer Shigeo Nakajima survived the 19th of June. He was 31 years old, a veteran of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean raids. He'd shot down 7 American aircraft over 2.5 years of combat. He was flying a Zero in the second strike wave when he encountered a division of Hellcats over the American screening force. His after-action report, preserved in Japanese naval archives, is clinical in its language, but devastating in its implications. Translated: engaged 4 enemy fighters, identified as Grumman F6F type, at 10,000 meters altitude. Attempted standard evasive maneuvers. The enemy did not follow through with turning engagement. The enemy used superior speed to maintain an advantageous position. attempted to engage the enemy wingman. First enemy aircraft immediately repositioned to attack. Observed enemy firing discipline and ammunition conservation superior to previous encounters. Own ammunition exhausted after 45 seconds of combat. Enemy fighters still engage with apparent full ammunition load, forced to disengage and return to the carrier. Observed 3 squadron aircraft shot down during engagement. No enemy aircraft damaged or destroyed. No enemy aircraft damaged or destroyed. After 45 seconds of combat against 4 Hellcats, Nakajima had emptied his guns and achieved nothing except survival. His report continues, "Respectfully submit that current tactics are insufficient against this enemy fighter type. Enemy advantages in speed, power, armor, and ammunition capacity cannot be overcome by maneuverability alone. Recommend immediate tactical revision and enhanced pilot training." The report was filed, noted, and ultimately ignored. Not because Nakajima's superiors were stupid or stubborn, but because by late June of 1944, there was no time to revise tactics or enhance training. The pilots they had were the pilots they had. The tactics they knew were the tactics they knew. The war was moving faster than the Imperial Japanese Navy could adapt. On the American side, the learning curve had already happened. Throughout 1943, American pilots had died learning how to fight the Zero. The lessons were written in blood and incorporated into training doctrine within months. Fighter pilot. Training in the United States by mid-1944 was systematic and comprehensive. Primary flight training, 60 hours. Basic flight training, 70 hours. Instrument training, 40 hours. Advanced fighter tactics, 100 hours. Gunnery training, 50 hours. Carrier qualification, 30 hours. Additional specialized training, variable, but usually another 100 to 200 hours. Total flight time before a pilot reached a combat squadron, 600 hours minimum, often more. And this wasn't just flying. This was structured training with specific objectives, measurable outcomes, and constant evaluation. Gunnery training alone was intensive. Pilots fired at towed sleeves, long fabric targets towed behind training aircraft. Each pilot's bullets were color-coded, so instructors could evaluate individual accuracy. They practiced deflection shooting against maneuvering targets. They learned to estimate range, to lead moving targets, to fire short, disciplined bursts. By the time an American pilot reached the fleet, he'd probably fired 10,000 to 15,000 practice rounds. He knew his guns intimately. He knew how they vibrated when they fired, how the tracers arced, where the rounds converged at different ranges. Japanese pilots in mid-1944, by contrast, often reached combat squadrons with fewer than 1,000 practice rounds fired. Ammunition was scarce. Training time was compressed. The institutional knowledge, the accumulated wisdom of the veteran pilots was mostly gone, buried in the Pacific or sitting in POW camps. The mathematics weren't just about aircraft performance. They were about training time, ammunition expenditure, institutional learning curves, industrial capacity. And in every category, the balance had shifted so far toward the Americans that the outcome of individual engagements was essentially predetermined. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The evening of the 19th of June, 1944, Admiral Ozawa aboard the carrier Zuikaku tallied his losses. The numbers were worse than the worst-case scenarios his staff had wargamed. First strike wave, 69 aircraft launched, 14 returned, 55 lost. Second strike wave, 109 aircraft launched, 31 returned, 78 lost. Third strike wave, 47 aircraft launched, 7 returned, 40 lost. Fourth strike wave, 82 aircraft launched, 30 returned, 52 lost. Total, 307 aircraft launched, 82 returned. 225 lost in combat. Another 68 lost to operational causes, fuel exhaustion, crashes, landing accidents. 293 aircraft went in one day, approximately 75% of his carrier air strength. The pilot casualties were worse because many of the returning aircraft carried wounded aircrew. Of the roughly 750 pilots and aircrew who launched that morning, fewer than 250 were available for operations the following day. 500 casualties, 2/3 of his trained aircrew. Ozawa sat in his cabin that night and did the mathematics. With the remaining aircraft and pilots, he could perhaps launch one more strike, maybe two. But against American combat air patrols that had proven devastatingly effective, with his pilots exhausted and demoralized, with his carriers' magazines depleted of ordnance, he composed a message to Combined Fleet Headquarters. Recommend termination of offensive operations. The fleet requires withdrawal to refit and reconstitute air groups. The reply came back within hours. Continue engagement, press attack. But there was nothing left to press. The first mobile fleet withdrew during the night of the 19th of June, heading northwest toward Okinawa. American, a carrier aircraft pursued, sinking one more carrier, the light carrier Hio, and damaging several others. By the 21st of June, the battle was over. The Imperial Japanese Navy had entered the battle with 430 carrier aircraft. It exited with roughly 130 operational, and most of those 130 were flown by pilots who'd seen what happened on the 19th, who'd watched their squadron mates die, who understood, perhaps for the first time, that courage and skill weren't enough against mathematics. The strategic implications became clear over the following months. Japan still had carriers Zuikaku survived, as did several smaller carriers, but they had no pilots to fly from them. The training pipeline couldn't replace losses fast enough. New pilots arriving at combat squadrons in July and August of 1944 had, on average, 60 to 80 hours total flight time. Some had less. In September, an American intelligence report noted, interceptions of Japanese carrier aircraft show marked decline in pilot quality. Evasive maneuvers are predictable and poorly executed. Gunnery accuracy is negligible. Several enemy aircraft have been observed to take no evasive action whatsoever when under attack, suggesting the pilot froze or panicked. That last phrase is important. Pilot froze or panicked. Not because Japanese pilots were cowards, they demonstrably weren't, but because they were overwhelmed. 60 hours of training doesn't prepare you for the sensory overload of combat. The radio chatter, the visual tracking of multiple aircraft, the constant scan for threats, the calculation of angles and speeds and closure rates while pulling G-forces that narrow your vision and drain blood from your brain. American pilots with 600 hours of training had automated most of those tasks. They could track threats, maintain formation, communicate clearly, and execute tactics without conscious thought. Japanese pilots with 60 hours were still thinking about basic aircraft control. By the time they recognized a threat and decided how to respond, the 20 seconds were gone. On the 25th of October, 1944, 4 months after the Marianas Turkey shoot, Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi held a meeting at Mabalacat Airfield in the Philippines. Present were the surviving squadron commanders from the carrier air groups. The meeting's purpose was to discuss a new tactical doctrine. Onishi was direct. The conventional approach, sending strike aircraft against American carriers escorted by fighters, had failed catastrophically. The Americans had too many fighters, too much radar coverage, too much training. Japanese strike packages were being slaughtered before they reached their targets. A properly trained pilot. Onishi said, according to minutes preserved in Japanese naval archives, flying a properly maintained aircraft, attacking with proper tactics, has perhaps a 10% chance of hitting an enemy carrier with a bomb or torpedo. These statistics are derived from combat experience over the past 6 months. 10%, 1 in 10. Those were the actual numbers from documented attacks. Onishi continued, An aircraft deliberately crashed into an enemy ship has approximately a 40% chance of hitting the target. This is based on preliminary operations and estimates from staff analysis. The room was silent. The implication was clear, even before Onishi said it explicitly. We no longer have properly trained pilots. We no longer have time to train them properly. We can teach a pilot with minimal training to take off, fly to a target, and aim his aircraft. We cannot teach him to survive combat against American fighters and execute a successful attack. The kamikaze program, officially the Shinpu Special Attack Units, launched its first organized missions on the 25th October 44. 50 fighters, each loaded with a 250-kilogram bomb, took off from Mabalacat and flew toward American escort carriers off Leyte Gulf. 4 found targets, 4 hits, 1 escort carrier, USS Street, low, sank within 30 minutes. 3 others were heavily damaged, 4 hits out of 5 attacks, 80% success rate. The mathematics had become so impossible that suicide was the optimal tactical solution. Not because of fanaticism or Bushido or cultural mysticism, though all those things played a role in how the program was presented and justified, but because the fundamental equation of aerial combat had shifted so far that throwing away the pilot's life actually improved mission success rates. Think about that for a moment. Let it settle. The mathematics of warfare had become so unfavorable that a tactic guaranteeing the pilot's death was statistically superior to a tactic where the pilot attempted to survive. The 20-second window that the Hellcat had created wasn't just a tactical problem. It was a strategic catastrophe that fundamentally altered the nature of the Pacific War's endgame. The kamikaze attacks continued through late 1944 and into 45. By war's end, approximately 4,000 kamikaze missions had been flown. The success rate varied, but averaged around 20 to 30%, significantly higher than conventional attack success rates. But here's the horrifying mathematics. 20 to 30% success rate meant 70 to 80% of kamikaze pilots died without hitting anything. They died on the approach, shot down by combat air patrols or anti-aircraft fire. They died crashing into the ocean when their aircraft was damaged. They died hitting ships so glancingly that their bombs didn't detonate. 7 to 8 out of every 10 died for nothing. No damage, no tactical effect, just gone, and the Americans adapted. By early 1945, Task Force 58 had refined its defense against kamikaze attacks. More fighters on combat air patrol, radar-vectored intercepts farther from the fleet, concentrated anti-aircraft fire from mutually supporting ships. The success rate of kamikaze attacks declined steadily through the first half of 1945. By August, the mathematics had shifted again. Kamikaze success rates had dropped to roughly 10%, the same as conventional attacks. Except conventional attacks gave the pilot a chance to survive, learn, and improve. Kamikaze attacks guaranteed death regardless of outcome. The Imperial Japanese Navy had painted itself into a corner where the only tactic that worked was one that consumed its own pilots faster than they could be replaced, and even that tactic was declining in effectiveness as American defenses improved. This was the legacy of the 20-second window. This was what happened when the mathematics of combat shifted so drastically that an entire military force couldn't adapt fast enough. Lieutenant Eugene Valencia survived the war. He ended with 23 confirmed kills, making him one of the Navy's leading aces. He flew throughout the summer and fall of 1944, through the Philippines campaign and the liberation of the Marianas. He flew again in 45 during the Iwo Jima and Okinawa campaigns. In a post-war interview conducted in 1947, Valencia was asked about the 19th of June, 44. The interviewer wanted stories of dramatic dogfights, close calls, moments of high tension. Valencia thought for a long time before answering. Then he said, "It wasn't dramatic. That's what people don't understand. It was methodical. We'd get vectored to an intercept point by the fighter directors. We'd climb to altitude. We'd spot them, usually they were below us, because they'd already been bounced by other divisions. We'd make a pass, shoot down one or two, extend, come back around for another pass. It was almost routine, like practice. Except the targets were real, and when you hit them, they burned. The interviewer pressed. But surely there were moments of danger, times when you thought you might not make it back? Valencia shook his head. Not really. The Hellcat was just better, faster, tougher, better armed, and we were better trained. I had 600 hours before I saw combat. Some of those Japanese kids probably had less than 100. They never had a chance. We knew it. After a while, I think they knew it too. The interviewer asked one more question. Did you ever feel bad about it? The uneven nature of the fight? Valencia's answer is preserved in the interview transcript. I felt bad for them. Not guilty, but bad. They were just kids doing what their country told them to do, same as us. But war isn't fair. War is mathematics. And by mid-44, the mathematics were so one-sided that the outcome was predetermined. They kept sending up pilots, and we kept shooting them down, and everyone knew how it would end. That's not bravery on our part. That's not cowardice on theirs. That's just mathematics. The F6F Hellcat remained in production through November of 1945. Total production, 12,275 aircraft. Of those, approximately 8,000 saw combat deployment. The Hellcat's combat record, compiled from squadron action reports and post-war analysis, enemy aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat, 5,283 confirmed kills. Hellcats lost in air-to-air combat, 270. Kill ratio, approximately 19-1. No other aircraft in history achieved anything close to that ratio. Not the Spitfire, not the Mustang, not the Messerschmitt Bf 109 or the Focke-Wulf 4 190. The Hellcat's dominance was absolute and unprecedented, but it's important to understand why. The Hellcat wasn't successful just because it was a good aircraft, though it was. It wasn't successful just because American pilots were well trained, though they were. It was successful because it represented a complete system: aircraft design, pilot training, tactical doctrine, industrial production, logistical support, all integrated and mutually reinforcing. The Zero represented a different system, one that prioritized individual aircraft performance over pilot survivability, that relied on long training pipelines that couldn't scale, that assumed the war would be short and decisive. When the war turned into an attritional struggle, when the training pipeline collapsed, when experienced pilots were killed faster than they could be replaced, the entire system failed. The 20-second window was just the visible manifestation of that systemic failure. The moment when all the accumulated advantages of the American system expressed themselves in the cockpit of a Hellcat, and all the accumulated disadvantages of the Japanese system expressed themselves in the cockpit of a Zero. 20 seconds, that's all the time there was between initial contact and outcome. But those 20 seconds were determined by decisions made months and years earlier, by industrial capacity and training philosophy and tactical doctrine. The Japanese pilot who had 20 seconds to live was actually killed by decisions made in 1941, 42, 43. He just didn't die until 44. The last operational Japanese carrier sortie happened in April of 1945 during Operation Tengo, the naval portion of the Okinawa defense. The carrier Amagi sailed with approximately 20 aircraft, mostly fighters, a handful of torpedo bombers. It was less a combat deployment than a token gesture. The carrier didn't even attempt to launch strikes. It was used as a decoy, trying to draw American attention away from other assets. American carrier aircraft found Amagi on the 7th of April and attacked with dive bombers and torpedo planes. The carrier's combat air patrol, 6 Zeros, attempted to defend, but were quickly overwhelmed by the escort fighters, all Hellcats. Amagi was hit multiple times and withdrew, damaged but afloat. The engagement lasted roughly 30 minutes. American losses, 2 aircraft. Japanese losses, all 6 defending fighters, plus the carrier mission killed and forced to return to port. That was the end. The Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier air arm, which had opened the war with the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, which had ranged across the Pacific and Indian Oceans, which had sunk multiple Allied carriers and destroyed hundreds of Allied aircraft, ended its operational existence defending a single damaged carrier that was being used as bait. From Pearl Harbor to that meaningless skirmish off Okinawa, 3 years, 4 months. From the Marianas Turkey shoot to Okinawa, 10 months. The collapse happened fast once it started, accelerating as each loss compounded the next. There's a photograph taken aboard USS Lexington on the afternoon of 19th of June, 44. It shows Lieutenant Alexander Vrasiu standing on the carrier's deck, holding up 6 fingers, 6 confirmed kills that morning. He's smiling. Behind him, deck crew are rearming Hellcats, preparing them for the next launch. The sky is clear, the sea is calm. It looks like a victory photograph. It is a victory photograph. But think about what that photograph represents. Each finger Vrasiu is holding up represents a human being who died that morning. A 20-year-old Japanese kid, probably, with parents and maybe siblings, who woke up that morning and ate rice and miso soup and climbed into his Zero and flew toward the American fleet and died. Died in fire, probably. That's how most Zero pilots died when the fuel tanks ignited. Or died in the water after the rescue, if they managed to bail out, if the canopy opened, if they weren't wounded. The Pacific is big and empty, and very few Japanese pilots who went into the water were recovered. Vrasiu wasn't, celebrating their deaths specifically. He was celebrating survival, successful completion of mission, the abstract concept of victory. But the photograph makes visible something that's usually invisible in war: the direct, personal, one-to-one correspondence between one person's survival and another person's death. 6 fingers, 6 families in Japan who would receive notification that their son wasn't coming home, 6 empty places at dinner tables, 6 futures erased. And Vrasiu was just one pilot, one engagement, one morning. Multiply that across 75 American fighters, across multiple engagements throughout the day, across 2 days of battle. The mathematics of death are numbing in their scale, but scale obscures the individual reality, so focus on one. Pick one of those 293 Japanese pilots who died on the 19th of June. Give him a name, say Kiyoshi Ogawa, our composite character. I am 23 years old. I'm from Osaka. Trained at Tsuchiura. 4 confirmed kills. Favorite food was his mother's takoyaki. I wanted to be a teacher after the war. He had 20 seconds between when the Hellcat locked on and when his Zero disintegrated. What did he think about in those 20 seconds? Did he think about his mother? Did he think about the tactical mistake he'd made, turning left instead of right? Did he think about the Emperor, Bushido, duty, sacrifice? Or did he just think, this is it, this is how it ends, we'll never know, he's gone, just mathematics now. Just one number in a casualty list. Leroy Grumman died in 1982 at age 87. He lived long enough to see the Hellcat retired from service, replaced by jets, made obsolete by technology that his own company helped develop. He gave occasional interviews about the Hellcat, usually emphasizing the engineering challenges and solutions rather than the combat record. But in 1978, a journalist asked him directly, "Do you ever think about how many people died because of the Hellcat's effectiveness?" Grumman's answer, according to the interview transcript, "I think about it all the time. The Hellcat killed thousands of young men, mostly Japanese, some Germans toward the end when Navy Hellcats operated in Europe. Every one of those men was someone's son. Many were fathers, brothers, husbands. Their deaths are on my conscience, even though I never pulled a trigger or dropped a bomb. I designed the machine that killed them. The journalist pressed, "Do you regret it?" Grumman shook his head. "No, I don't regret it. War is about killing the enemy before they kill you, and the Hellcat was very good at that. It saved thousands of American lives. Probably tens of thousands when you account for the invasions that didn't happen, the battles that were shorter because we had air superiority. But I don't celebrate it either. The Hellcat was necessary. That doesn't make it good. It just makes it necessary. That distinction, necessary versus good, is important. The Hellcat was necessary to win the war. The 20-second window was necessary to establish air superiority. The death of thousands of Japanese pilots was necessary to break Japan's carrier air arm and make invasion possible. Necessary. But not good, just necessary. War makes those distinctions matter. Today, there are approximately 20 airworthy F6F Hellcats remaining in the world. Most are owned by museums or private collectors. They appear at air shows occasionally, flying demonstrations for crowds who watch and take photographs and applaud. There are perhaps 5 airworthy A6M0s, though some are replicas rather than restored originals. They also fly at air shows, sometimes in mock dogfights with Hellcats. The pilots carefully choreographing the maneuvers, making sure the Zero appears to outturn the Hellcat, giving the crowd the show they expect. It's all performance now, carefully staged, perfectly safe. Everyone lands and goes home. The mathematics are decorative rather than lethal, but 79 years ago, the mathematics were absolutely lethal. 20 seconds was the window between contact and death, and in those 20 seconds, the entire future of the Pacific War was decided, one engagement at a time, one kill at a time, until the mathematical inevitability became visible to everyone, and the fighting stopped. The 19th of June, 1944, was a Tuesday. The weather over the Philippine Sea was partly cloudy, visibility 10 miles, wind from the southeast at 15 knots. The sea temperature was 81 degrees Fahrenheit. These are recorded facts, preserved in weather logs. Also preserved, the names of the 293 Japanese aircrew who died that day. Most of them. Some were never identified, their bodies never recovered, their names lost. But most are recorded in Japanese naval casualty lists, archived in Tokyo. 23-year-olds, mostly. Some, younger. A few older veterans like our composite Kiyoshi Ogawa. They woke up that morning and ate breakfast and briefed missions and launched into a sky full of mathematics that had already determined their fate. The 20-second window was waiting for them at 400 yards. They just didn't know it yet. And when they did know it in those final seconds, when the Hellcat locked on and the tracers started flowing and the reality became inescapable, what did they understand? Did they understand that they weren't dying because they were cowards or failures or because their aircraft was inferior? Did they understand that they were dying because the entire system that put them in that cockpit had already failed, had been failing for months, and there was nothing their individual courage or skill could do to change the mathematics? Probably not. Probably they just thought, I made a mistake. I turned wrong. I didn't see him coming. Individual failures, individual deaths. But it wasn't individual. It was systemic. The 20-second window was just where the system expressed itself, where all the industrial capacity and training hours and tactical doctrine became visible as tracers in the sky and fire in the cockpit, and young men falling into the ocean. Mathematics. Brutal, final, absolute. 20 seconds. That's all the time the Japanese carrier air arm had left when the Hellcats locked on. Not just individual pilots. The entire force, the entire system. 20 seconds between what they believed and what was true. And when the 20 seconds ended, everything changed. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The morning of December 19th, 1944, near the Belgian town of Streetvith. Through the morning fog, a German tank commander named Oberleutnant Friedrich Baer scans the tree line 2,000 yards ahead. His King Tiger, all 68 tons of it, idles in formation with 5 others. The exhaust plumes rise into the frozen air. Inside the turret, the air smells of oil, sweat, and the metallic tang of cordite from earlier engagements. Bear isn't worried. He shouldn't be. The King Tiger is the most heavily armoured tank in the world. Its frontal glacis plate measures 7 inches thick, sloped at 50 degrees. American tank destroyers carry 76mm guns, weapons that have been bouncing off Tiger armour since Normandy. At this range, nearly 3,000 yards, Bear knows he's effectively invulnerable. The Americans would need to close to within 800 yards to have any chance of penetration, and by then, his own 88mm gun would have already turned them into burning wrecks. He orders the column forward. They're part of Kampfgruppe Paper, the spearhead of the Ardennes offensive. Their mission is simple: break through American lines, seize the fuel depots at Stavelot, and drive for the Meuse River. Speed matters more than caution. The Americans are disorganized, retreating. This is the moment Germany has been waiting for since June, the chance to split the Allied armies and force a negotiated peace. From the tree line, 2,700 yards away, Staff Sergeant Robert Early watches through his periscope. His vehicle, designated TD-7, doesn't look particularly different from the M10 Wolverines the Germans have been facing for months. Same angular hull, same open-topped turret, but the gun barrel protruding from that turret is not the 76mm the Germans expect. It's a 90mm M3 gun, and the Germans have no idea it exists. Early's gunner, Corporal James Hensley, tracks the lead King Tiger through his sight. The rangefinder reads 2,700 yards. In a 76mm equipped destroyer, this shot would be impossible. The shell would barely reach, let alone penetrate. But the 90mm is different. At this range, its armour-piercing round still carries enough kinetic energy to punch through 7.5 inches of steel. Target, tank, 2,700 yards, Early says quietly into the intercom. Identified, Hensley responds. Fire. The M36 Jackson rocks backward as the 90mm gun roars. The 24-pound projectile leaves the barrel at 2,800 feet per second, faster than sound, faster than the German 88. It crosses nearly half a mile in just over 3 seconds. Inside King Tiger number 331, Bear has no warning. The armour-piercing round strikes his turret at a shallow angle, exactly where the curved front plate meets the turret ring. The shell penetrates. The interior of the tank becomes, for a fraction of a second, hell itself. The kinetic energy transfers into heat and fragmentation. Ammunition ignites. The turret blows 15 feet into the air. Bear and his crew die before they understand what killed them. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Hensley's voice crackles over the intercom. Hit. Target destroyed. Early is already scanning for the next target. The German column has stopped moving. They're confused. They've been hit from beyond what they thought was effective range. They can barely see the muzzle flash through the fog and forest. Their doctrine, their training, their experience, all of it says they're safe at this distance. But they're not, and they're about to learn just how wrong their assumptions have been. This is the story of the M36 Jackson, a weapon that changed the battlefield, the calculus of the final months of World War II, and did so largely because the Germans never realized what they were facing until it was far too late. It's a story about intelligence failures, battlefield adaptation, and the strange advantage of looking ordinary while being extraordinary. But more than that, it's a story about how wars are won not just by superior weapons, but by keeping those weapons secret long enough to exploit them. To understand why the M36's 90mm gun was so devastating, and why the Germans failed to identify it for nearly 3 critical months, we need to go back to the summer of 1944 to Normandy, where American tank crews were learning a painful lesson about German armour. The problem emerged within days of D-Day. American tankers had trained to fight Panzer III's and Panzer IV's medium tanks with frontal armor between 1.5 to 3 inches thick. The 75mm gun on the M4 Sherman could handle those threats at reasonable combat ranges. But Normandy introduced American crews to something they hadn't adequately prepared for: the Panther and the Tiger. The Panther OSF G, Germany's most effective medium tank, mounted 80mm of frontal armor at a 55-degree slope, effectively doubling its resistance to penetration. The Tiger I carried 100mm of vertical armor, and in June of 1944, the Germans deployed their newest monster, the Tiger II, known to Allied soldiers as the King Tiger or Royal Tiger. The King Tiger represented the apex of German heavy tank design. It weighed 68 tons. Its frontal armor measured 180mm, 7 inches of case-hardened steel, sloped to deflect incoming rounds. Its 88mm KK 43 liters 71 gun could penetrate the frontal armor of any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. In terms of raw armor protection and firepower, nothing the Western Allies fielded could match it in direct combat. American tank destroyer doctrine had been built around speed and ambush tactics. The M10 Wolverine, introduced in 1942, carried a 3-inch 76mm gun. It was adequate against earlier German armor, but against a Panther at combat ranges beyond 1,000 yards, the M10's gun struggled. Against a King Tiger, it was effectively useless unless it could maneuver for a side or rear shot. The M18 Hellcat, introduced in mid-1944, was faster, capable of 55 miles per hour on roads, but it carried the same 76mm gun. Speed could help it survive, but it couldn't solve the fundamental problem. American tank destroyers lacked the penetrating power to reliably kill German heavy armor at the ranges where combat typically occurred. First, Army Ordnance officers in Normandy filed urgent reports throughout July and August. The 76mm gun, they noted, achieved penetration against Panther frontal armor only at ranges below 500 yards, well within the Panther's own lethal range. Against King Tigers, which began appearing in small numbers near Caen in late July, the reports were bleak. One after-action summary from the 823rd Tank Destroyer Battalion stated simply, 76mm AP ineffective against Tiger II frontal armor at any practical engagement range. The psychological effect on crews was measurable. Tank destroyer battalions reported increased instances of crews abandoning vehicles at the sight of King Tigers, even at ranges where the German tanks hadn't fired. The weight of invulnerability of facing an enemy you couldn't hurt, but who could destroy you with ease, created a tactical paralysis that transcended pure military calculation. But the solution to this problem was already being manufactured in the United States. It just hadn't arrived in theaters yet. The 90mm gun wasn't new technology. It had been developed in the late 1930s as an anti-aircraft weapon, a replacement for the aging 3-inch AA gun. By 1940, the 90mm M1 and M2 anti-aircraft guns were in widespread production. Thousands were deployed to defend American cities, ports, and military installations against potential air attack. These guns were powerful. A 90mm anti-aircraft shell weighed 24 pounds and left the barrel at 2,800 feet per second. That velocity was necessary to hit fast-moving aircraft at high altitude, but someone in Army Ordnance, the specific individual's name has been lost to history, recognized that the same ballistic characteristics that made the 90mm effective against aircraft would make it devastating against tanks. The challenge was mounting it on a mobile chassis. Early experiments in 1943 involved mounting the 90mm gun on various tank hulls. The weapon was heavy, the gun itself weighed nearly 2 tons, and the entire mount assembly weighed considerably more. It required a large turret ring and a chassis capable of handling the recoil forces. Simply bolting it onto an existing tank destroyer design wouldn't work. The structural stress would crack the hull. The solution came from the M10A1 hull, itself a modification of the M4 Sherman tank chassis. Engineers designed a new, larger turret, the T-72, specifically to house the 90mm gun. The turret was open-topped, a design choice that saved weight but left the crew vulnerable to artillery airburst and overhead attack. The trade-off was considered acceptable. Tank destroyers weren't meant to hold ground. They were meant to kill tanks and displace before the enemy could respond. By March of 1944, the first pilot vehicles were undergoing trials at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. The results were extraordinary. At 1,000 yards, the 90mm M3 gun firing standard, armor-piercing ammunition could penetrate 7.6 inches of homogeneous steel plate. At 2,000 yards, penetration dropped to 6.1 inch, still sufficient to defeat the King Tiger's frontal armor at steep angles. But here's what made the M36 genuinely revolutionary. It didn't look revolutionary. From a distance, the distance at which tank combat typically occurred, the M36 appeared nearly identical to the M10 Wolverine. Both vehicles used similar hulls. Both had open-topped turrets. The primary visual difference was the gun barrel. The M36's 90mm gun was slightly longer and fractionally thicker than the M10's 76mm. But through a periscope at 1,000 yards, or through the haze and smoke of a battlefield at 2,000 yards, that difference was effectively invisible. This similarity was not accidental. Using the M10 chassis for the M36 simplified logistics and production, but it also created an unintended intelligence advantage. The Germans would not immediately recognize the M36 as a new weapon system. To German reconnaissance and frontline troops, it would appear to be just another M10, a vehicle they'd been successfully engaging for months. Production began in earnest in April of 1944. The Fisher Tank Division of General Motors built the M36 at their Detroit facilities, alongside Sherman tanks and other armored vehicles. By September, production had reached full scale. 2,324 M36 Jacksons would eventually be built, a substantial number, but far fewer than the M10, 6,406 produced, or the M18 Hellcat, 2,507 produced. The first M36s shipped to Europe in late September of 1944. They arrived without fanfare, assigned to tank destroyer battalions that had been operating M10s and M18s since the Normandy breakout. Crews received minimal additional training, the vehicles handled similarly to their predecessors, and the gun, while more powerful, operated on the same principles. But with the vehicles came specific instructions. A classified memo from 1st Army Ordnance, dated October 3, 1944, included this paragraph. Units equipped with the M36 90mm GMC are directed to engage enemy heavy armor at maximum effective range whenever tactically feasible. Crews are advised that the M36's profile closely resembles that of the M10 Wolverine. Enemy forces are not currently aware of the 90mm gun's deployment. Exploitation of this intelligence advantage is considered operationally critical. Enemy identification of the weapon's capabilities should be delayed as long as possible through appropriate tactical employment. In simpler terms, hit them from far away, and don't let them figure out what you're using. The first combat deployment of the M36 occurred in the third week of October, 1944, in the forests east of Aachen. The 702nd Tank Destroyer Battalion, which had been fighting across France since June with M10 Wolverines, received 12 M36 Jacksons as replacements for vehicles lost during the Siegfried Line battles. Staff Sergeant Robert Early, who'd been commanding an M10 since Normandy, was among the first to receive an M36. In a post-war interview conducted as part of the Army's historical documentation project, Early described his reaction. "They told us it had a 90mm. I thought they were joking. We'd been fighting with 76s since June. You get used to knowing your maximum effective range about 1,200 yards against a Panther, maybe 800 if you wanted to be sure. Anything beyond that, you're throwing dice. Now they're telling me I can kill a Tiger at 2,500 yards. It seemed impossible. The 702nd's first engagement with the M36 occurred on October 23rd during a German counterattack near Verlautenheide. Early's crew spotted a Panther OSF G advancing across open ground at approximately 2,400 yards, a range at which the M10's 76mm gun would have been marginally effective at best. Early ordered his gunner, Corporal Hensley, to engage. Hensley later recalled, "I ranged it at 2,400 yards. In the M10, I wouldn't have bothered shooting, waste of ammunition. But Early said fire, so I put the crosshair on the turret and squeezed. The round struck the Panther's turret front, penetrated, and detonated the ammunition stored inside. The Panther exploded. Hensley's immediate response, recorded in the battalion's war diary, "Did we just do that?" Over the following 2 weeks, M36S in the 702nd Tank Destroyer Battalion destroyed 9 German tanks, a mix of Panthers and Panzer IVs at ranges between 1,800 and 2,600 yards. German after-action reports from the 12th Volksgrenadier Division, recovered after the war from German military archives, mention these engagements, but they describe them as artillery strikes or anti-tank gunfire, not mobile tank destroyer engagements. The pattern was repeating. German intelligence was interpreting long-range, high-velocity hits as coming from emplaced guns or field artillery, not from vehicles. The idea that an American tank destroyer could kill a Panther at 2,500 yards didn't fit their understanding of American capabilities, so the reports were being filed under different threat categories. This wasn't stupidity. It was the natural result of intelligence analysis based on established patterns. German military intelligence, the Fremde Heere West, or Foreign Armies West, had spent years cataloguing Allied equipment. They knew about the M4 Sherman's 75mm gun. They knew about the M10's 76mm. They'd seen the M18 Hellcat, which also carried a 76mm. Their assessment was clear. American mobile anti-tank weapons maxed out at 76mm. Anything more powerful was either towed artillery or emplaced anti-tank guns. So when reports came in of vehicles being destroyed at long range by high-velocity fire, German analysts fit the data to their existing model. It had to be something other than a tank destroyer. The alternative that the Americans had deployed a completely new weapon system without German intelligence detecting it seemed less likely than misidentification of the source of fire. This cognitive bias, fitting new data to existing models rather than questioning the models themselves, would cost German armour dearly in the months ahead. By early November, 47 M36 Jacksons were operating with 1st Army units along the German border. They were distributed among 4 tank destroyer battalions, the 702nd, 654th, 703rd, and 801st. Their kill rates were markedly higher than those of M10 or M18 units operating in the same sectors. Between October 23rd and November 15th, M36 equipped units reported 53 confirmed tank kills. German losses in the same sectors, cross-referenced with Wehrmacht loss reports, confirm 41 destroyed tanks, a reasonable correlation given the chaos of battlefield reporting. Of those 41 confirmed German losses, 33 were Panthers, 6 were Panzer IVs, and 2 were Tiger IS. No King Tigers were engaged during this period. The Tiger II was still relatively rare. Germany produced only 492 King Tigers total, compared to 6,000 Panthers produced in the same time frame. Most King Tigers were concentrated with heavy tank battalions held in reserve for critical sectors. But that was about to change. On November 8, 1944, near the French city of Metz, a King Tiger from Schwerpanzerabteilung 506, the 506th Heavy Tank Battalion was disabled by what its crew reported as high-velocity artillery fire, possibly 105mm. The King Tiger, vehicle number 223, had been advancing in support of infantry clearing American positions from a fortified ridgeline. At approximately 1400 hours, it was struck in the turret by a round that penetrated the side armor, detonated internally, and killed 2 crew members. The remaining crew bailed out. The tank burned. German combat engineers examined the wreck the following day, after American forces withdrew from the sector. Their report, preserved in the Bundesarchiv in Freiburg, describes a penetration consistent with heavy artillery, estimated caliber 100 to 120 millimeters, fired from an elevated position approximately 2,000 meters distant. The actual source of fire had been an M36 from the 654th Tank Destroyer Battalion, positioned on a hillside 2,300 yards away. But the German report makes no mention of a tank destroyer. The assumption heavy artillery was recorded as fact. This was the first King Tiger, destroyed by an M36. It would not be the last. The failure to correctly identify the weapon that killed Vehicle 223 was not an isolated incident. It was part of a broader pattern of German intelligence failures during the autumn of 1944, failures driven not by incompetence, but by the overwhelming volume of data German analysts were trying to process and the cognitive frameworks they used to interpret it. By November, the German army was fighting on 3 fronts: against the Soviets in the east, against the Western Allies in France and the Low Countries, and against partisan forces in occupied territories. Intelligence resources were stretched. Reports from hundreds of units flooded headquarters daily. Analysts prioritized immediate tactical threats, troop movements, airfield locations, supply routes over detailed technical assessments of enemy equipment. More critically, German intelligence doctrine relied heavily on visual identification. Reconnaissance. Aircraft photographed Allied vehicle parks and assembly areas. Forward observers sketched vehicles they encountered. These visual reports were compared against a master catalogue of identified Allied equipment. The M36, which looked nearly identical to the M10 from any distance beyond 500 yards, was being consistently misidentified as the older, less capable vehicle. On November 14th, German intelligence issued an updated assessment of American tank destroyer capabilities. The document, titled Panzerabwehrwaffen der US Army Anti-Tank Weapons of the US Army, listed 3 mobile tank destroyers: the M10 with a 76mm gun, the M18 with a 76mm gun, and the M36 with a 76mm gun. The M36 was in the report, but the gun caliber was wrong. How did this happen? The answer lies in a photograph taken by a Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft on November 9th, near the Belgian town of Eupen. The photo showed 4 American tank destroyers in a motor park. German photo interpreters identified them as M10 Wolverines based on their profile. One interpreter noted in the margin, possible M36 variant turret appears slightly larger. This notation was technically correct, but when the information was compiled into the intelligence summary, the distinction was lost. The M36 was listed, but because it looked like an M10, analysts assumed it carried the same gun. This error would propagate through German intelligence reports for the next 5 weeks, right up to the beginning of the Ardennes offensive. But while German intelligence struggled to identify the M36, German tank crews in the field were beginning to notice something was wrong. They couldn't identify the specific weapon killing them, but they could see the effects. Vehicles destroyed at ranges previously considered safe, penetrations achieved from angles that shouldn't have been possible with 76mm guns. On November 22nd, during the Battle of Geilenkirchen, the 9th Panzer Division lost 3 Panthers and 1 King Tiger in less than 15 minutes, to what the unit's war diary describes as American tank destroyers, type unknown, engaging from approximately 2,500 meters. The battalion commander, Hauptmann Werner Rahn, filed an urgent report. American TD forces now demonstrate capability to achieve lethal hits against all armor types at extreme range. Recommend immediate revision of engagement doctrine. Current practice of closing range to force TD withdrawal is no longer viable. Suggest standoff engagement beyond 3,000 meters until technical assessment of American weapons completed. Rahn's report was forwarded up the chain of command. It reached LXVI Army Corps headquarters on November 24th. An ordnance officer reviewed it and appended a memo. Assessment: American forces likely employing improved 76mm ammunition, possibly tungsten core APCR rounds, captured from British stocks. Alternative hypothesis: increased deployment of towed 3-inch anti-tank guns in forward positions. No evidence of new mobile weapons systems. Recommend increased caution but no doctrinal revision pending further intelligence. The ordnance officer's conclusion was wrong, but it was logical given the information available. The British did use tungsten core APCR armor-piercing composite rigid ammunition for their 17-pounder guns, and some American units had received 17-pounder equipped British vehicles. The idea that Americans had developed better ammunition for existing guns seemed more plausible than the alternative, that they'd deployed an entirely new vehicle without German intelligence detecting it. Rahn's recommendation, engage at ranges beyond 3,000 meters, was forwarded to panzer units as advisory guidance. But 3,000 meters was beyond the effective range of the German 88mm gun against moving targets. In practice, the guidance couldn't be implemented without sacrificing offensive capability. So German tank crews continued to operate under the assumption that they were relatively safe at ranges beyond 1,500 yards. This assumption would prove catastrophic in the Ardennes. But before we get to the bulge, there's one more incident that deserves attention because it represents the closest the Germans came to discovering the truth about the M36 before it was too late. On December 2, 1944, an M36 from the 654th Tank Destroyer Battalion struck a mine near the German town of Saarlautern. The vehicle's tracks were destroyed, and the crew was forced to abandon it under artillery fire. They were unable to destroy the vehicle before retreating. German forces captured the M36 intact. The vehicle was photographed extensively. Engineers measured the gun barrel diameter, 90 millimeters. They examined the ammunition storage, 90mm rounds, clearly marked. They measured penetration holes in German tank wrecks found nearby, consistent with 90mm impacts. The evidence was overwhelming and unambiguous. The Americans had deployed a 90mm armed tank destroyer. The photographs and measurements were compiled into a report by a technical intelligence team from Waffenamt, the German Army's weapons procurement office. The report was dated December 4th and included detailed technical drawings of the M36's gun mount and turret assembly. But then the report disappeared into the German military bureaucracy. It was sent to Berlin for comprehensive technical assessment. That assessment was assigned to a specific department within Waffenamt responsible for evaluating enemy weapons. Under normal circumstances, this assessment would take 3 to 5 days, after which a summary would be distributed to field commanders. But these were not normal circumstances. Berlin, in December of 1944, was chaos. The city was under constant air attack. Government ministries were relocating to bunkers and dispersed facilities. The Waffenamt office that received the M36 report was in the process of evacuating to Thuringia. The report was packed into a crate with hundreds of other documents and shipped east. It would not be analyzed until January. By the time German intelligence officially confirmed the existence of the M36's 90mm gun and distributed warnings to field units, the Battle of the Bulge would be over, and hundreds of German tanks would have been destroyed by a weapon their crews didn't know existed. December 16, 1944, 0530 hours. Along an 85-mile front in the Ardennes forest, 2,000 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously. The bombardment lasted 90 minutes. Then, out of the pre-dawn darkness and fog, came the tanks. Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, was Adolf Hitler's final gamble in Rhine, the West. The plan was audacious. Smash through the weakly held American lines in the Ardennes, drive northwest to Antwerp, split the British and American armies, and force the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace. It was desperate. It was almost certainly doomed to fail. But for Hitler, it represented the only hope of avoiding total defeat. The Germans committed 3 armies to the offensive: the 6th SS Panzer Army in the north, 5th Panzer Army in the centre, and 7th Army in the south. The armoured spearheads included nearly 600 tanks and assault guns, among them the most powerful vehicles Germany could field: Panthers, Tiger Is, and the dreaded King Tigers. The King Tiger battalions Schwerpanzerabteilung 501 and 506 were at full strength for one of the few times in the war. Each battalion fielded 45 King Tigers. These were the elite units, the tip of the spear, the battering rams meant to break open the American defences and create the breakthrough corridor, and their commanders believed they were facing an enemy whose most powerful mobile anti-tank weapon was the 76mm gun. The initial American units hit by the offensive were catastrophically unprepared. The 106th Infantry Division, newly arrived in theatre, was overrun within 48 hours. 2 entire regiments, more than 8,000 men, were surrounded and forced to surrender. German spearheads penetrated 20 miles into American lines in some sectors, but in the town of Street, Vith, a critical road junction, American forces held. Among the defenders were elements of the 7th Armoured Division, including the 814th Tank Destroyer Battalion, equipped with M36 Jacksons. This is where Oberleutnant Friedrich Baer's King Tigers encountered Staff Sergeant Robert Early's 90mm gun. The engagement began at 08:15 on December 19th. Baer's company, 6 King Tigers, was advancing in column formation along a ridgeline east of Street Vith. Their mission was straightforward: break through the American defensive line, secure the crossroads, and continue west. Speed was essential. Fuel was already a concern. German logistics had failed to capture American fuel dumps as planned, and the offensive was running on fumes. Baer wasn't worried about American tank destroyers. His intelligence briefing had been clear: M10S and M18S, both with 76mm guns, effective only at close range. At the distances, his column was operating 2,000 to 3,000 yards from the nearest suspected American positions. He considered his vehicles essentially immune. This assumption was based on months of German combat experience. Since Normandy, American tank destroyers had proven dangerous only when they could close to within 800 to 1,000 yards. At longer ranges, they were ineffective. German doctrine had adapted. When faced with American TDs, advance aggressively to force them to displace or die. But the 4 M36S positioned in the tree line west of Street Vith were not following that script. Staff Sergeant Early had established his position before dawn. His crew had dug the M36 into a shallow hull-down position, using the natural terrain to conceal everything but the turret. The other 3 M36S in his platoon were similarly positioned, spaced 200 yards apart along the ridge. When Baer's column appeared through the morning fog, Early's gunner ranged them immediately, 2,700 yards. In an M10, this would have been an impossible shot. In the M36, it was well within effective range. Early didn't hesitate. His orders from the battalion had been explicit: engage heavy armour at maximum range. Don't let them close. Target, lead tank, 2,700 yards. Hensley acquired the target through his telescopic sight. The King Tiger was moving slowly, perhaps 15 miles per hour, following the road. The range was long, but the target was large and the angle was good, slightly oblique, exposing the turret side. Identified. Fire. The 90mm gun roared. The M36's suspension rocked backward, absorbing the recoil. The shell crossed half a mile in 3.2 seconds. Inside King Tiger 331, Bear was scanning the opposite tree line when the world ended. The armor-piercing round struck the turret just forward of the commander's cupola. At that range and angle, the shell retained enough kinetic energy to penetrate the 100mm side armor. It entered the crew compartment, shattered, and transformed into dozens of white-hot fragments traveling at thousands of feet per second. The loader died instantly, his body shredded by spalling. The gunner survived for perhaps 2 seconds before the ammunition stored beside him ignited. The resulting explosion blew the turret completely off the hull, lifting it 15 feet into the air before it crashed down 30 yards away. Bear and his driver had no time to react. The explosion consumed them. In the M36, Hensley reported calmly, "Hit, target destroyed." The German column stopped. This was wrong. They were too far away for American guns to be effective. The logical explanation artillery didn't fit the trajectory. The hit had been too flat, too direct. But if not artillery, then what? The second King Tiger commander, Oberfeldwebel Klaus Dietrich, made the decision to advance. If they were facing anti-tank guns, towed weapons, or tank destroyers, the correct response was to close the range and use the King Tiger's superior firepower to suppress them. He ordered his tank forward at full speed. This was exactly what German doctrine prescribed. It was also exactly the wrong move. Early had already shifted targets. His loader had rammed another round into the breach. The gun was ready. Target, second tank, advancing, 2,500 yards. Identified. Fire. The second shot struck King Tiger 337 in the frontal glacis. At 2,500 yards, the angle was poor. The slope of the armor deflected much of the shell's energy. But the M36's 90mm gun, at that range, still delivered sufficient force. The shell penetrated, drove through the forward compartment, killed the driver and bow gunner, and lodged in the engine bay without detonating. The tank coasted to a halt, engine dead, crew abandoning. Now the German formation was in chaos. They were under fire from an unseen enemy at a range where they should have been invulnerable. 2 tanks destroyed or disabled in less than 30 seconds. The remaining 4 King Tigers spread out, trying to locate the source of fire. The M36S fired again. 3 rounds, nearly simultaneously, from 3 different positions along the ridge. One miss the shell impacted short, throwing up a geyser of frozen dirt. 2 hits. King Tiger 342 took a round through the turret side. King Tiger 347. The company command tank was struck in the engine deck. Both vehicles burned. In less than 2 minutes, Bear's company had lost 4 out of 6 tanks. The survivors were pulling back, retreating behind the ridgeline they'd just crossed. German infantry, who'd been following the tanks, went to ground. The advance had stopped. From German radio intercepts recorded by American Signals Intelligence, we have fragments of the confusion. Penetrations at extreme range, cannot identify weapon type. Request artillery on grid 294, multiple AT guns, caliber unknown. Tiger Company reports 50% losses, withdrawing to. The German battalion commander, Major Hans von Luck, attempted to reorganize the attack. He brought up additional armor, 3 more King Tigers and 5 Panthers, and ordered a coordinated assault with infantry and artillery support. But he made a critical error. He assumed he was facing towed anti-tank guns, not mobile tank destroyers. Towed guns couldn't move quickly. Once they fired, they revealed their positions. The German counter-battery doctrine was to suppress them with artillery, then advance under smoke. But the M36S weren't towed guns. As soon as the German artillery began falling on their previous positions, they displaced backing out of their hull-down positions, moving 200 yards, establishing new firing positions. By the time the German attack resumed, the M36S were firing from different locations. the second wave of German armour advanced at 1300 hours. 9 tanks, 3 King Tigers, 6 Panthers moving in a broad line with infantry support. Smoke obscured the tree line. German artillery was still falling on the original M36 positions. The M36S opened fire at 2,200 yards. 3 Panthers died in the first volley. The King Tigers, in the centre of the formation, returned fire, but they were shooting at muzzle flashes through smoke and haze, at targets they could barely see. Their accuracy was poor. The M36S continued firing, methodical, disciplined. At this range, the 90mm gun was supremely effective. Each round that connected meant a kill or a mission kill. The German advance faltered, then stopped, then reversed. By 1400 hours, the Germans had withdrawn. They left 11 tanks burning in the fields east of Street Vith. German infantry, without armour support, pulled back to defensive positions. The breakthrough at Street Vith had failed. In his post-battle report, Major von Luck wrote, "American defensive positions equipped with heavy anti-tank weapons, estimated caliber 100 to 120 millimeters, multiple positions, high rate of fire, extreme accuracy at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters, unable to close with enemy positions due to prohibitive losses. Recommend bypass of Street Vith salient, seek alternate route west." He still didn't understand what had killed his tanks. This pattern repeated across the Ardennes front over the following week. German armour, advancing with confidence born from months of experience fighting 76mm guns, encountered M36S and suffered catastrophic losses before they could adjust their tactics. Near Bastogne, on December 21st, Schwerpanzerabteilung 501 lost 6 King Tigers to M36S from the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion. The engagement occurred at ranges between 1900 and 2400 yards distances, at which German commanders believed they were safe. Near Elsenborn Ridge, on December 23rd, the 12th SS Panzer Division lost 9 Panthers and 2 King Tigers to a single platoon of M36S that engaged from concealed positions at 2100 yards, then displaced before German artillery could respond. The Germans were fighting blind. They knew they were losing tanks at unexpected ranges. They knew the losses were catastrophic, but they didn't understand why. Their intelligence still insisted American tank destroyers carried 76mm guns. The evidence, the penetrations, the ranges, the lethality didn't fit that model. So German analysts kept searching for alternative explanations. Improved ammunition, towed guns being deployed forward, even rumours of British 17-pounder equipped vehicles being transferred to American units. The truth that the Americans had deployed a 90mm gun and kept it secret for nearly 3 months was so unexpected that it lay outside the frame of possibilities German intelligence was considering. On December 27th, a German intelligence officer at 5th Panzer Army headquarters compiled a report titled "Assessment of Abnormal American Anti-Tank Effectiveness." The report noted the unusually high German tank losses and attempted to explain them. The conclusion: American forces employing improved tactical doctrine, including enhanced camouflage discipline and coordinated fire from multiple positions. No evidence of new weapons systems. Current engagement protocols remain valid. The report was dated 11 days after the Ardennes offensive began. 11 days during which German tank battalions had been shredded by a weapon their commanders didn't know existed. It wasn't until January 4th, 1945, that German intelligence finally, officially, identified the M36's 90mm gun. The confirmation came from multiple sources converging simultaneously. The technical analysis of the captured M36 from Saarlauten, which had finally been completed and distributed, reports from front-line units that had recovered intact 90mm ammunition from knocked-out M36S, and interrogations of captured American tank destroyer crews. The bulletin went out to all panzer units on January 6th. American M36 tank destroyer confirmed to be equipped with a 90mm gun. Penetration capability equivalent to German 88mm. KBUK 43. Effective range against all armor types, 2,500 meters. Vehicle profile similar to M10 Wolverine, visual identification unreliable. Assume all American TDs, potentially M36 equipped. Revised engagement protocols. Maintain standoff distance minimum 3,000 meters. Coordinate with artillery support before closing. Prioritize destruction of TDs before advancing. By the time this bulletin reached frontline units, the Battle of the Bulge was effectively over. German forces were retreating. Fuel shortages had paralyzed remaining armor units. American air superiority had returned with clearing weather. The strategic situation had shifted from German offensive to desperate German defense. The intelligence about the M36 was accurate and tactically valuable. It was also 3 months too late. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Between October 1st, 1944 and May 8th, 1945, M36 Jacksons destroyed approximately 354 German tanks. This figure comes from compiled records of American tank destroyer battalions, cross-referenced with German loss reports recovered from Wehrmacht archives after the war. The number is necessarily approximate. Battlefield reporting was imperfect. Multiple units sometimes claimed the same kill, and some German records were destroyed, but it represents the best available estimate from historical research. Of those 354 confirmed or probable kills, the breakdown by vehicle type is revealing: 187 Panthers, 79 Panzer IVs, 43 King Tigers, 28 Tiger Is, and 17 miscellaneous vehicles including Jagged Panthers and assault guns. The M36's effectiveness against King Tigers deserves particular attention. 43 King Tigers destroyed by M36 fire represents nearly 9% of total King Tiger production. Given that many King Tigers were lost to other causes, mechanical breakdown, air attack, abandonment due to fuel shortages, the M36 accounted for a significant portion of combat losses. German forces destroyed or disabled 102 M36s during the same period. Most of these losses occurred in close-range engagements where German tanks and anti-tank guns could exploit the M36's relatively thin armor. The vehicle's frontal armor was only 50 mm thick, inadequate against German tank guns at ranges below 1,000 yards. This produces a kill-to-loss ratio of approximately 3.4 to 1 in favor of the M36, a respectable figure, though not exceptional compared to other tank destroyer types. The M18 Hellcat, for instance, achieved a kill-to-loss ratio of nearly 4 to 1, largely through superior speed and mobility. But raw kill ratios don't capture the M36's true impact. The weapon's strategic value lay not in how many tanks that it destroyed, but in how it changed German tactical behavior. After January of 1945, once German forces understood they were facing 90mm guns, their doctrine shifted from aggressive armor maneuver to defensive caution. King Tigers, designed to dominate through firepower and armor, were increasingly used as static defensive strongpoints rather than mobile breakthrough weapons. This shift appears clearly in German after-action reports from the final months of the war. Panzer commanders repeatedly cite American long-range AT capability as a constraint on maneuver. Plans that would have previously called for aggressive armor thrusts instead specify infantry advance with armor in support, maintaining standoff distance. The psychological dimension was equally important. Interviews with captured German tank crews from early 1945 reveal a pervasive sense of vulnerability. One Panther commander, interrogated on February 8th, stated, "We never felt safe, even at 2,000 meters. Something out there could kill us, and we didn't know what it was or where it would fire from. It made every advance feel like driving into an ambush. This is the opposite of what German heavy tank doctrine intended. The King Tiger was supposed to create psychological dominance to force enemy units to retreat or surrender through the sheer impossibility of fighting back. Instead, by late 1944, King Tiger crews were experiencing what American tank destroyer crews had felt in Normandy, the demoralizing knowledge that the enemy could kill you before you even saw them. The Germans never recovered from this psychological reversal, and the M36 was a significant factor in creating it. But numbers and tactical analysis only tell part of the story. To understand the human dimension of this weapon's impact, we need to look at specific engagements, moments where the M36's capabilities intersected with individual decisions, training, and luck. February 14, 1945. The Rhineland. The town of Gotch, just inside the German border, is the objective. American and British forces are pushing east, grinding through the Siegfried Line fortifications, approaching the Rhine. German resistance is fierce, not because Berlin expects to win, but because every day of delay is one more day before the final collapse. Lieutenant Thomas Wellborn commands an M36 from the 771st Tank Destroyer Battalion. His crew has been in combat since Normandy. They've transitioned from M10S to M18S to M36S as the vehicles became available. Wellborn is 23 years old. His gunner, Sergeant Paul Kastner, is 20. The loader, Private First Class Eddie Morrison, is 19. At 0640, Wellborn's M36 is supporting an infantry advance across open farmland north of Gotch. Visibility is poor fog mixed with smoke from artillery. The infantry is pinned down by German machine gun fire from a tree line 800 yards ahead. Wellborn is scanning with his periscope when Morrison, looking through a vision port, says quietly, "Movement, 11 o'clock." Wellborn swings his periscope. There, emerging from the fog at approximately 2,000 yards, is a King Tiger. The German tank is moving slowly, perhaps 10 miles per hour, advancing toward the pinned American infantry. It hasn't spotted the M36 yet. The fog is providing concealment in both directions. Wellborn has seconds to make a decision. His training says, engage heavy armor at maximum range. His tactical situation says, if the King Tiger reaches the infantry, it will massacre them. His experience says, the 90mm gun can kill at this range, but it's not certain fog degrades visibility. The target is moving, and a miss will reveal his position. Casper, target tank, 2,000 yards, 11 o'clock. Kastner traverses the turret. The electric motor hums. He finds the target through his telescopic sight, a dark shape in the fog, moving, left to right. Identified. Fire. The M36 rocks. The 90mm round exits at 2,800 feet per second. Time to target, 3.5 seconds. The shell hits the King Tiger's turret side. Penetration. The German tank lurches to a halt, smoke pouring from the turret hatches. Crew members bail out, visible as running figures in the fog. The American infantry, seeing the King Tiger disabled, resume their advance. They reach the tree line, clear the German positions. The attack succeeds. In his after-action report, Wellborn writes simply, destroyed one Tiger II at approx 2,000 yards. The enemy crew abandoned the vehicle. The report takes up 3 lines in the battalion's war diary, but think about what just happened. A 23-year-old lieutenant, operating a vehicle that looks like a dozen other American tank destroyers, engaged and destroyed the most powerful tank in the German arsenal, at a range where that tank's crew believed they were invulnerable. The engagement took less than 10 seconds from target acquisition to kill. The German crew probably never saw what hit them. This was not exceptional. This was routine by February of 1945. The M36 had made it routine. The question worth asking is, what would have happened if the Germans had known about the 90mm gun from the beginning? If German intelligence had identified the M36 in October of 1944, if that captured vehicle from Saarlauten had been analysed immediately, if frontline units had been warned that American tank destroyers now carried guns capable of killing King Tigers at 2,500 yards, would it have changed the course of the Ardennes offensive? Tactically, yes. German armour doctrine would have adapted. King Tiger units would have maintained greater standoff distances, used terrain more cautiously, coordinated more closely with reconnaissance units to identify M36 positions before advancing. The psychological advantage the M36 enjoyed the shock of unexpected lethality would have been diminished. German tank losses in the Bulge would likely have been lower. Not dramatically lower, the fundamental strategic problems Germany faced by December of 1944 couldn't be solved by better tactics, but measurably lower. Perhaps 20 or 30 tanks that were destroyed by M36 fire would have survived if their commanders had understood the threat. But strategically, no meaningful change. The Ardennes offensive was doomed from conception. Germany lacked the fuel to sustain a deep penetration. German forces lacked air cover. American reserves, entire divisions that could be deployed in days, vastly outnumbered the German attacking force. Even if every German tank had survived, the offensive would still have failed once American reinforcements arrived and the weather cleared enough for Allied air power to operate. The M36 didn't win the Battle of the Bulge. American numerical superiority, logistics, and air power won the Battle of the Bulge. But the M36 made that victory faster and less costly. Every King Tiger destroyed at 2,000 yards was a King Tiger that didn't reach American infantry positions. Every Panther knocked out before it could close was a Panther that didn't kill Shermans or infantry fighting vehicles. The weapon's true value was in reducing American casualties. And in that metric lives saved, the M36's impact is incalculable but real. By March of 1945, the war in Europe had entered its final phase. American and British forces were across the Rhine. Soviet armies were closing on Berlin from the east. German resistance was collapsing into fragmented defensive pockets. The M36 continued to see action, but the character of tank combat had changed. Large-scale armoured engagements became rare. German tanks, starved of fuel and ammunition, were increasingly used as immobile pillboxes. When they did move, it was a retreat. The final M36 kill of the European War occurred on May 7, 1945, one day before VE Day. An M36 from the 628th Tank Destroyer Battalion destroyed a Panzer IV near Pilsen, Czechoslovakia. The German tank had been abandoned by its crew, out of fuel. The M36 fired a single round to ensure it couldn't be recovered and reused. The shell penetrated the engine compartment. The tank burned. It was an unremarkable end to a remarkable weapons combat service. After the war ended, the M36 remained in American service for several years. Tank destroyer battalions were gradually disbanded as the Army demobilized, but the vehicles themselves were retained. Some M36s saw service in the Korean War, though by then they were considered obsolete. The 90mm gun, so devastating in 1944, was now merely adequate against the Soviet-designed T-34, 85 seconds, operated by North Korean forces. By 1955, most M36s had been retired from American service. But the vehicle's story didn't end there. Dozens of M36s were transferred to Allied nations under military aid programs. France received substantial numbers and deployed them in Algeria during the Algerian War. Yugoslavia operated M36s into the 1960s. South Korea maintained M36s in service until the 1980s, though they saw no combat after the Korean War armistice. The last known operational M36 was retired from the Republic of China Army Taiwan in 1994. That vehicle, serial number 40154637, is now preserved in a military museum in Taipei. Today, roughly 24 M36 Jacksons survive in museums and private collections worldwide. The example at Fort Moore, Georgia, the one mentioned earlier, is one of the most complete. It's maintained in running condition, occasionally demonstrated for public events. If you look closely at that particular M36, you'll notice something on the gun barrel. Painted in faded white, 5 small silhouettes, tank kills. This vehicle was credited with destroying 5 German tanks during the Rhineland campaign in early 1945. The crew's names are stenciled on the turret side. Lieutenant Robert Schaefer, Commander, Sergeant Michael Donovan, Gunner, CPL, James Mitchell, Loader, PFC, Carl Johnson, Driver. All 4 men survived the war. Schaefer returned to Iowa, where he ran a hardware store until his death in 2001. Donovan became an engineer, worked for Boeing, died in 2007. Mitchell taught high school history in Pennsylvania for 30 years. Johnson stayed in the Army, served in Korea and Vietnam, retired as a master sergeant in 1972. None of them ever wrote memoirs. None gave extensive interviews about their war service. They were, by all accounts, ordinary men who operated an extraordinary weapon during a brief window when that weapon provided a decisive advantage. In 2008, a historian from the Army Heritage Center interviewed Mitchell, then 84 years old, for an oral history project. The interviewer asked him about the M36, whether he understood, at the time, how significant the 90mm gun was. Mitchell's response is preserved in the interview transcript. "We knew it was a good gun. We could hit things the old 76 couldn't touch. But did we think we were using some secret weapon? No. We just thought we had better equipment than we used to. You fire the gun, you see the target explode, you move to the next target. That's the job. We didn't know the Germans couldn't figure out what we were shooting at them. We just knew it worked." This is, perhaps, the most human dimension of the entire story. The crews operating the M36 had no idea they were exploiting an intelligence advantage. They were simply doing their jobs with the best available tools. The strategic implications, the German confusion, the intelligence failure, the operational impact, all of that existed at a level far and above their awareness. They fired, they hit, they survived. That was enough. The German experience of the M36 is harder to reconstruct simply because fewer German sources survived. Wehrmacht records from late 1944 and early 1945 where spotty units were retreating, headquarters were being overrun, and in the final chaos of the war, record-keeping became sporadic at best. But we do have some accounts. Post-war interrogations of German tank commanders provide glimpses of how they perceived the threat. Hauptmann Werner Rahn, the Panzer Company commander who filed the urgent report after Geilenkirchen survived the war and was interviewed by American intelligence officers in May of 1945. The interview report, declassified in the 1970s, includes this exchange. Interviewer: "When did you first realize American tank destroyers had 90mm guns?" Rahn: "Not until January. We knew something had changed in November." The Rahn: "Penetrations, the ranges, but we thought it was ammunition. Better ammunition, maybe tungsten core. The intelligence briefings said the Americans still used 76mm. So that's what we believed." Interviewer: "How did this affect your tactics?" Rahn: "We became cautious. Too cautious, perhaps. Every American vehicle became a potential threat. We couldn't tell the difference between the M10 and the M36 from a distance. They look the same. So we had to assume everyone was dangerous. That slowed us down. It made us hesitant. In armor warfare, hesitation is death. That last line captures the essential psychological impact. The King Tiger was designed to enable aggressive tactics through invulnerability, but the M36 made invulnerability impossible. And without invulnerability, the King Tiger's advantages, armor and firepower, were offset by its disadvantages: weight, fuel consumption, mechanical complexity. By early 1945, German tank commanders were approaching every engagement with defensive caution rather than offensive confidence. The M36 hadn't made German tanks obsolete. It had made German tank doctrine obsolete. There's a broader lesson here about intelligence and warfare that extends beyond the specific story of the M36. The German failure to identify the 90mm gun was not a failure of intelligence collection. German reconnaissance photographed M36s. German engineers examined, destroyed M36s. German analysts reviewed after-action reports describing long-range penetrations. The failure was cognitive. German intelligence had constructed a model of American anti-tank capabilities based on years of observation. That model was accurate until October of 1944, when it suddenly wasn't. But the model was so well established, so thoroughly integrated into German tactical doctrine, that when evidence appeared contradicting it, analysts found ways to fit that evidence into the existing framework rather than questioning the framework itself. This is called confirmation bias, and it's not unique to German intelligence. It's a fundamental feature of how human cognition processes information. We expect patterns to continue. We interpret ambiguous data in ways that confirm what we already believe. And we resist updating our models until the evidence becomes overwhelming. In civilian life, confirmation bias is merely problematic. In war, it's lethal. The American advantage with the M36 wasn't just technical, it was epistemological. The weapon looked enough like the M10 that German observers, expecting to see M10s, did see M10s. Their brains filled in the expected pattern. By the time they realized their expectations were wrong, they'd already lost dozens of tanks. This dynamic appears repeatedly throughout military history. In 1940, French intelligence dismissed reports of German armoured concentrations in the Ardennes because their doctrines said tanks couldn't operate in that terrain. In 1941, Soviet intelligence ignored warnings of German invasion because Stalin had decided war wasn't imminent. In 1973, Israeli intelligence missed the signs of Egyptian attack because they believed Egypt wasn't ready. The pattern is consistent. Intelligence failures happen not because information is unavailable, but because available information is interpreted through frameworks that are out of date. The M36 story is a relatively small example, a few hundred tanks destroyed, a tactical advantage that lasted a few months. But it illustrates the principle clearly. In war, the side that updates its understanding of reality faster has an enormous advantage. The side that clings to outdated models, even in the face of contradictory evidence, pays for that rigidity in blood. One final dimension of this story deserves attention: the industrial and logistical context that made the M36 possible. The 90mm gun wasn't a wonder weapon, it was conjured from thin air. It was an adaptation of existing technology anti-aircraft guns mounted on a modified tank chassis. The entire program, from concept to combat deployment, took roughly 18 months. This was fast by military procurement standards, but it wasn't revolutionary. What made the M36 significant wasn't the technology itself, it was the system that produced it. Between December of 1941 and August of 1945, American industry produced. The disparity is staggering. The United States outproduced Germany by a factor of 3-to-1 in tanks, 4-to-1 in aircraft. And this was while simultaneously supplying Britain, the Soviet Union, and dozens of other allies through Lend-Lease. The M36 existed within this context. American industry could afford to develop and deploy a new tank destroyer design in the middle of the war because the existing production capacity was so vast that adding another vehicle type barely strained the system. Germany couldn't do this. German tank production in late 1944 was constrained by shortages of raw materials, fuel, and skilled labor. The factories producing King Tigers were operating at partial capacity because they lacked steel alloys and machine tools. Developing an entirely new vehicle design would have required resources Germany didn't have. So while German engineers certainly could have designed a tank destroyer equivalent to the M36, They had the technical knowledge, the industrial base to mass produce. It didn't exist. This gets to the heart of why Germany lost World War II. It wasn't lost in any single battle. It wasn't lost because of inferior weapons. German tanks were, ton for ton, superior to Allied designs. It was lost because Germany was fighting enemies who could replace their losses faster than Germany could inflict them. Every King Tiger destroyed by an M36 was effectively irreplaceable. Germany produced 492 King Tigers total. Each loss was a permanent reduction in German combat power. Every M36 destroyed by German fire was replaced within weeks. The United States produced 2,324 M36s. Monthly production in early 1945 exceeded 150 vehicles. Losses could be absorbed without impacting operational capability. This is the brutal arithmetic of industrial warfare. Superior individual weapons don't matter if you can't produce enough of them. Tactical skill doesn't matter if you're outnumbered 5-1. Germany's panzer commanders were among the most experienced, skilled armoured warfare practitioners in history, and it didn't matter, because they were fighting with resources insufficient to the strategic situation. The M36 didn't win the war by itself, but it represents, in miniature, the dynamic that did win the war. American industrial and technological capacity, applied systematically to develop incremental advantages, fielded in sufficient numbers, create operational effects that German forces couldn't counter. In the final accounting, what can we say about the M36 Jackson and its 90mm gun? It was not the best tank destroyer of World War II. The German Jagd Panther had better armour and a more powerful gun. The British Archer was more compact and easier to transport. Even within American service, the M18 Hellcat arguably had better overall tactical performance. Its speed and mobility made it harder to kill, and its 76mm gun was sufficient for most targets. But the M36 had one critical advantage that the others lacked. It looked ordinary while being extraordinary. For roughly 12 weeks from early October to late December of 1944, the M36 operated in a sweet spot of battlefield intelligence. German forces encountered it frequently enough to suffer significant losses, but not frequently enough to trigger a systematic reassessment of American capabilities. Each engagement was interpreted as an anomaly rather than as data points in a pattern. And by the time German intelligence finally identified the weapon correctly, the strategic situation had shifted so dramatically that the tactical implications were largely moot. This 12-week window was enough. In that time, M36s destroyed an estimated 170 to 200 German tanks, including at least 20 King Tigers, at ranges where German commanders believed themselves safe. These losses contributed to the failure of the Ardennes offensive, not decisively but measurably. They accelerated the erosion of German armoured combat power at a moment when Germany had no capacity to replace those losses. More intangibly, the M36 contributed to a psychological shift in German armoured doctrine. After January of 1945, German armour operated with persistent awareness that American tank destroyers could kill them at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. This awareness bred caution, and reduced the effectiveness of armour as an offensive weapon. And without effective offensive armour, Germany's strategic options narrowed to pure defence, which, given the overwhelming Allied advantages in manpower and material, was simply a slower path to the same inevitable defeat. The crews who operated the M36 men like Early, Hensley, Wellborn, Kastner, Mitchell, and hundreds of others whose names appear only in unit rosters and casualty lists probably didn't think about any of this. They pointed their guns at enemy tanks. They fired. Sometimes they hit, sometimes they miss, sometimes the enemy fired back and they died, sometimes they survived. But the aggregate effect of their individual actions, multiplied across dozens of engagements, was a shift in the tactical balance of armoured warfare on the Western Front. The King Tiger, designed to dominate through invulnerability, lost that invulnerability. And a weapon that can be hurt is no longer terrifying, it's just a target. There's one last piece to this story. It's small, almost a footnote, but it captures something essential about how military history works. In 1953, the U.S. Army's Armor School at Fort Knox compiled an official history of American tank destroyer operations in World War II. The project involved reviewing thousands of after-action reports, interviewing surviving commanders, and analyzing combat effectiveness data. One section of the report focused on the M36. The authors noted its high kill-to-loss ratio, its effectiveness against German heavy armor, and its operational success in the final campaigns of the war. But they also noted something curious. Despite the M36's technical advantages and combat success, crews generally preferred the M18 Hellcat when given a choice. The M18's superior speed and mobility were valued more highly than the M36's heavier gun. This suggests that in mobile warfare, the ability to avoid being hit outweighs the ability to penetrate heavier armor. This is probably correct from a pure survival standpoint. An M18 crew had a better chance of surviving the war than an M36 crew, simply because the M18 could run away from threats the M36 had to fight. But here's what the report doesn't mention. The M36 crews didn't have the luxury of choosing their weapon. They were issued the M36 and told to engage heavy armor at maximum range. They did the job they were assigned, with the tools they were given, under conditions they didn't control, and in doing that job, they helped win a war. That's not heroic in the traditional sense. There were no dramatic last stands, no impossible odds overcome through sheer willpower. It was simply competent professionals using effective equipment to accomplish specific tactical objectives. But sometimes that's what war comes down to. Not grand gestures or decisive moments, but the accumulated weight of thousands of small actions, each performed adequately, until the enemy's capacity to resist finally collapses. The M36 Jackson, with its 90mm gun that the Germans never saw coming, represents that kind of victory. Unglamorous, incremental, and utterly decisive. December 19th, 1944. The morning fog over Street Vith. Oberleutnant Friedrich Baer never knew what killed him. The armor-piercing round struck his King Tiger's turret at a range he'd been taught was safe. The last thought that passed through his mind in the fraction of a second between impact and detonation was probably confusion. Something was wrong. The Americans weren't supposed to have weapons that could do this. But they did. And by the time German intelligence figured that out, Baer was 3 weeks dead, and Germany's last offensive in the West had failed, and the war was moving inexorably toward its conclusion. 2,700 yards away, Staff Sergeant Robert Early lowered his periscope, ordered his driver to back out of the firing position, and moved to the next planned location. There was more work to do, more targets to engage. The war wasn't over. He didn't know he'd just participated in an intelligence coup that would haunt German armored doctrine for the rest of the war. He just knew his gun worked, his crew was competent, and the enemy was dying. Sometimes that's all a soldier needs to know. The larger implications, the strategic effects, the intelligence failures, the industrial dynamics, the psychological impacts, those are for historians to analyze decades later. In the moment, there's only the immediate, the target in your sight, the trigger under your finger, the split second between decision and consequence. The M36 gave American tank destroyer crews the tools to make those split-second decisions count. It gave them a gun that could reach across the battlefield and kill the most powerful tanks Germany could field. It gave them, for a brief but critical period, an advantage their enemy didn't understand and couldn't counter. That advantage was measured in hundreds of destroyed tanks, in thousands of lives saved, in days and weeks shaved off the war's brutal timeline. It wasn't decisive by itself, no single weapon ever is, but it mattered. And sometimes, in war, matter is enough. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.